Our most worshipable Gurudev, His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupad, came to the Western world with a great ambition. Of course, he wasn't materially ambitious, but he planned not just to bring a religion. It's not a small thing to bring the religion of Krishna consciousness to the West, but by teaching the culture and the way of life that has traditionally been associated throughout eons with Krishna consciousness, he wanted to give a new direction to the world, to a cultural revolution, actually, spiritual revolution. If we say cultural revolution, people get shaky if they think what happened in China in the past. But Srila Prabhupada was the greatest philanthropist, the most munificent, benevolent person, in as much as he wanted to give people the knowledge and the practical implementation of it, whereby the present misdirected civilization can reverse its disaster course and come to live a way of life which is beneficial for everyone. It's a big job to do that, because the West is culturally dominant. In one of the books I wrote, Sri Bhakti Siddhanta Vaibhava, I gave an overview of what Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was up against in trying to preach what we now call Krishna consciousness in an India which was largely enamored at that time by everything Western. It was a mixed response. On one side, the Indian people could not fail to be impressed by the Western culture. On the other hand, many of them didn't feel entirely comfortable with it, and they didn't like to be dominated by it. Now, it's understandable that the Indian people, and the same thing was true in Africa and so many other places, the Indian people were in awe at the achievements of the Western people. The very fact that a small number of people from an entirely different culture were able to dominate a huge country with a huge population, that in itself was impressive. The Indians, the Hindus at least, worship various demigods, highly powerful personalities, but the Westerners, in many ways, they seem to be like gods. Their technology, all kinds of previously unimagined implements and machines. But one reason they're able to overcome India was their technological superiority in the military application of technological superiority, their organizational skills. There was no denying. It was unarguable, seemingly, that the Westerners were superior. The Indians might not have liked to admit it, but in worldly matters, they were drubbed. The West was way ahead. There were attempts, at that time, I'm talking about the time of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, at that time there were attempts to revive ancient Indian culture. There were various movements, like the Arya Samaj. There are other movements like the Brahma Samaj, which tried to take some of the best ideas of the West and graft those with, for want of a better term, Indian ideas. And there was the Ramakrishna mission, which the very term mission tried to present Hinduism in a format that was working for the Christians. They saw Christians were able to spread their message widely by doing social welfare work. So the Ramakrishna Mission also had an idea to do that. A lot of these, the Brahma Samaj, especially the Ramakrishna Mission, they were also responding to the Westerners' claims to be morally superior. The Westerners pointed out, what is this Hindu religion in which there's burning of widows, child marriage, multiple marriage. So in this way, the Westerners appeared, in the eyes of Indians, and of course there was a lot to do with the Westerners' propaganda also, they appeared to hold the moral high ground. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur attempted to adjust to the Western influence. He didn't try to throw it out. He wasn't a revolutionary in the sense of getting the British to quit India, but he made some adjustments with the Western influence and way of life by accepting and adopting much of or adapting to much of the cultural changes that were changing society. For instance, he allowed his sannyasis to go in motor cars. He brought his mutts, his places for monks to live. He made them not only in holy places, but particularly in the big cities of the Western world. Although purists eschewed the use of English language, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur preached in it and wrote in it, as well as, of course, his native Bengali. So he adjusted to a lot of the modern way of life to interact with the intellectuals of that time, the ones who are the movers and shakers, which meant not only the British themselves, but the Indians who had adopted in many ways the Western culture. But of course, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, while adopting to some of the Western cultural norms, he very strongly presented the pristine message of the Vedas. And our own Srila Prabhupada, he continued to do this when he went to the Western world. He did make many cultural adjustments, but clearly from his writings and his talks, he clearly wanted to reverse this cultural trend, seeing there's the completely bewildered materialistic civilization. That was one of the descriptions he gave of it, is most antithetical to the required way of life, or the optimum way of life for perfecting the rare human life by practicing Krishna consciousness. In other words, Srila Prabhupada wanted to bring not just a religion, which in and of itself is a huge achievement, that Srila Prabhupada did bring Krishna consciousness to the Western world, and many scholars, they approvingly noted that Srila Prabhupada, he didn't compromise to such a great extent that there was nothing really of the real culture and teachings left. As many of the gurus who came to the West, they made so many adjustments that if they had anything spiritual to offer, it was practically lost in all the adjustments. But Srila Prabhupada didn't do that. But not only did he introduce Krishna consciousness to the West, but he had a much more even ambitious plan to change the world, to bring Vedic culture to the whole world. And he did make adjustments, but he used the example of using wood to cut wood. In other words, a wooden handle is required for an axe head, which is used to cut a tree. So the paraphernalia of the Western way of life can be adopted to some extent with the aim of not necessarily destroying everything, but destroying the cultural and especially the intellectual underpinnings of Western society. The idea that science and technology is all in all, and it's not only Krishna consciousness is affected by that, but any theistic or mystical or metaphysical or even philosophical endeavor is undermined by the gross materialism that undermines the Western ethos, the way it is nowadays. So I proposed, that we as members of the Krishna consciousness movement, we don't realize, or maybe we've forgotten, what a tremendous endeavor Srila Prabhupada, what he was trying to do. We realize to some extent what a tremendous achievement he has made. But what more he wanted to do, the magnitude of Srila Prabhupada's mission, how he wanted to change the whole, significantly change the whole world. Not that Krishna consciousness should be a few people, but that it should become the dominant worldview, the dominant culture. It's so fantastic. It sounds so impossible that it sounds ridiculous. But then again, that Krishna consciousness at all could be introduced in the Western world did sound fantastic and ridiculous, and no one took Srila Prabhupada seriously, and they thought he was ridiculously idealistic and not practical and not realistic. Srila Prabhupada proved them wrong, that by Krishna's mercy, the impossible can become possible. So what was Srila Prabhupada trying to do? He was trying to establish a culture, a way of life, and a worldview based on the Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam, Mayadhyakshena prakritihi suyate sacharacharam hetunanena kauntaya jagadviparivartate. In contradistinction to and necessarily opposition to the dominant worldview, which is that, life is just going on and there's a big bang, and then everything fell into place, and here we are, that God is in control. God specifically means Krishna. By his oversight, everything comes into being, everything goes on. This is the mission of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, bequeathed to us by Srila Prabhupada. It's a massive mission. Of course, Srila Prabhupada's mission could be defined in various ways, expansive as it is, but certainly this aspect of it, which seems to be largely forgotten or minimized in ISKCON today. We can't deny that if we're actually to see what Srila Prabhupada's mission is. Unfortunately, in the Western world itself, the Krishna consciousness movement for the last several decades has been in a trough, in a lull. It's going on in many countries. It hasn't completely stopped, but mostly in the Western world nowadays, where it is going on well, it is due to the participation and support of ethnic Indians. Now, that's not true in Russia. Russia is an exception. There are many, many devotees in Russia, but outside of India, wherever the Krishna consciousness movement is doing well or fairly well, or at least having some impact and surviving, it's largely due to the participation of ethnic Indians, Hindus. Which, okay, well done. That it's good that in Bhakti Vedanta in Mana in London, and not this year because of the coronavirus, but tens of thousands of Indians from all over the country come, and so many become initiated, and there's similar success stories in America and Australia. So that's good. That's very good, no doubt. But that wasn't all of what Srila Prabhupada's mission was in the Western world. In one sense, we can say, well, it is. It's relatively easier to attract Indians because they're culturally already very much attuned to this and pious. But the real challenge, or the great challenge, is to do more. Already Indians have Krishna consciousness in their culture, but to bring it to people who are culturally far away from Krishna consciousness, to bring it to the Westerners, the Japanese, and who are not interested. Let's face it, the huge majority of people all over the world outside of the Hindu cultural milieu are not in the slightest bit interested in Krishna consciousness. Some of them have some kind of interest in things spiritual in a vague way. But to get Western people to take to Krishna consciousness seriously, as Srila Prabhupada did, is a tremendous challenge. And although most people in the Western world are not that much interested in science, in fact, here in India it seems there's more overt interest in science than there is in the West. The underlying worldview, this is what we're up against, the underlying worldview of the West. And when I say the West, well, it's everywhere nowadays, isn't it? The underlying worldview is what we may call the scientific, materialistic outlook, which is taught in schools all over the world. People grow up and believing it's a fact. That's the way the world is. Science knows. Nirvishesha shunyavadi paschatya desha tarne. When Srila Prabhupada penned this pranam mantra to himself, we generally think, well, that means Nirvishesha means Buddhists, and Mayavadi means followers of Shankaracharya. But it's not only that. The idea that impersonal forces govern the universe, and that everything in existence is only impersonal forces. This is at the root of the scientific worldview, that there are what in classical physics we may call atoms and molecules, and if you examine from quantum theory, then it's all just energy, or go deeper than that. There's simply energy. The whole universe is just energy. There's no need to bring God into any metaphysical idea into the picture. That is the underlying ubiquitous worldview. And people may have religions and this and that, but intellectually it's not taken very seriously by the mainstream that runs the world, we can say. The world runs on science more than it runs on religion. Of course, there are very powerful and influential religions also, but the dominant worldview is what we can say science. Just like science. Just like, for instance, here in India, when there's rain, people used to think Indra. Nowadays they don't. If they think about it at all, they may think in terms of high pressure, low pressure, in terms of meteorology. They don't think it's caused by any higher force. They think it's, well, that's just the way nature is acting. So the scientific outlook is very strong, but it's this generally agnostic outlook pervades not only the hard sciences, but the humanities, history, sociology, psychology. The academia is agnostic. The whole way of looking at the world is agnostic. Now I'm using the word here not in the sense of not believing in God, not believing in God, but not knowing, but the whole outlook has caused the tremendous acquisition of scientific knowledge and its application has been one of examining the world, trying to understand it, not coming to conclusions without clearly ascertaining them. No one person can establish a scientific law. It has to be peer-reviewed, refereed, accepted. In science, if any theory is to be accepted, it has to be demonstrated, and it has to, any experiments which are supposed to show the proof of a theory, they're supposed to be reproducible. So this attitude is there in all spheres. For instance, in history, we may say, well, the history of ancient Rome is like this, 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 and this, and this is, yes, this is it. But we're open to new discovery. Maybe we'll discover, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and then the understanding of the history of ancient Palestine and the religious history, the social history. It changed the whole. It was an absolutely unexpected discovery, but it in academic circles it changed the whole way of. It added massive new perspectives to the whole understanding of ancient Palestine and so on. So, okay, we know this about Rome. We have the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, classic work describing all that. But there may be more discoveries, you never know. And then we may have to revise our whole way of thinking. We may have thought that Nero was like this, or Julius Caesar was like this, based on what we know now. But you never know, we might get some more information. So it's like that. And in psychology and so many areas, yes, this is what we know. But what we know may change, because we may get more insights or we may get new information. So in this way, knowledge is not considered to be certain and 100% verifiable, but whatever works, we'll go along with that. That's especially in science. We may say, well, yeah, we know that in science we don't know so many things, but hey, look, there are a lot of things we do know also. And that's why it's possible, for instance, to have a recording of myself lying down here and speaking, and that's able to be broadcast all over the world because of various scientific researches and development, R&D, research and development. And although certainly we don't understand everything, this much practically we can demonstrate that we're on the right track, you can say. It works. So the underlying idea, it can be defined in a translated saying of an ancient Greek philosopher, Protagoras: man is the measure of all things. Man looks at things, tries to understand, understands to some extent, implements that understanding, and in this way human society makes progress. The magic word, progress. We're able to do so many things. So underlying that is the idea, then why do we need God? What man is discovering works. Now the fact that progress has brought so many problems, it doesn't seem to occur to so many people, or even if it's accepted, well, we'll do more research and more development and we'll overcome the problems. Okay, there's a pollution problem, but we'll do some research, we'll make more energy efficient automobiles, we'll, this non-renewable sources, fossil fuels, we'll change the technology so that we can harness the power of the universe from renewable sources, like solar power is the big hope, and it's going on. So in this way, yes, there are problems which have been created as unexpected and undesirable byproducts of progress, but we'll make more progress and be able in this way to overcome these problems. The only thing is that with the way we solve the problem also creates another problem, and it goes on like this and this and this. And the actual result, well, we can say the result, yeah, there's more affluence all over the world and has been known ever, probably. More people are living in solid houses, and people have all kinds of things that they didn't used to have, all kinds of gadgets and this and that, and the common man in many countries of the world can afford to have his motor cars and all kinds of things, and mass education, which previously wasn't there, and having to work hard in fields is now gone. Farming can be done on a mass scale, producing far more food than previously by employing much less people. So in this way, progress is there. And problems come, just like the farming. We're able to produce much more food, but that's at the expense of the environment, making pesticides, herbicides, toxic fertilizers, toxic in the sense that they upset the balance of the ecosystem, and so much land is destroyed to make farming fields, and so in so many ways there's so much imbalance in society. But overall, people are impressed by it and they don't want to change it. For instance, people don't think that Srila Prabhupad recommended, well, live simply. We have a problem with so much energy consumption produces so much pollution. Okay, well, live simply. We don't need to live. We don't need electricity. But people don't want to live like that. They're used to this way of life, and they don't want to go to simple living. And without that simple living, it is more difficult to get into the mode of high thinking, because we need to interact with the society which is unnecessarily extremely complex, and by its very nature tends to divert our attention away from the real goal of life, which is to develop our spiritual understanding, ultimately our Krishna consciousness, which simple living doesn't intrinsically promote Krishna consciousness, but it doesn't unnecessarily clutter our lives with all kinds of things to do that we don't really need to do, and working to maintain all kinds of things that we don't really need. So Srila Prabhupada's idea was to change this way of life, and one of his major focuses was on undermining the scientific grasp, or the grasp of the modern scientific worldview on the psyche of the whole human race. Science works. Science deals in facts. You can pray to God for food, but the scientists are making adjustments to nature whereby food is produced. Give us this day our daily bread. Yeah, okay, here you go. The scientists are giving. Of course, they don't see that ultimately, Maya Dakshena Prakriti, there is God behind it. They say you don't need to believe in God. Science deals in facts. Religion deals in beliefs. That's what they say, isn't it? And scientific understanding of facts, of the way the world actually works, translates into tangible, useful discoveries, which have transformed human society to a level of sophistication that was previously unimagined and continues to transform it. So it's better. It is better. Who can deny? Well, of course, even in the Western world, there are many people, not many, but some who are just cutting out of this way of life. They want to live more simply. But this so-called scientific outlook, it's highly materialistic in the sense it doesn't recognize the existence of the eternal soul. Janma mrityu jara vyadhi dukkha doshanu darshanam. Science can't stop birth, death, old age, and disease. In fact, in many ways, modern scientific advancements have made the problems worse. Just like previously, people used to go old, and then, okay, you're old, and then, all right, and then you die. But nowadays, when you get old, you have to, this idea that you have to go to the hospital and get all this diseases treated, instead of just let it, okay, the body's old and it's going to die soon. They keep on up until literally till the last moment of death, and sometimes even after the moment of death, they keep on pumping away with pumping in oxygen and having tubes, and the idea somehow or other we're going to sustain life. So instead of old age being something to be stoically accepted, somehow they're trying to keep people alive by any means and made it more miserable. Instead of being surrounded by loving relatives when you're passing away, and if they're really loving, they'll help you on your way by helping you to remember God. You're surrounded by doctors who don't really care that much for you, because how can you care for dozens of dying people all around you with tubes stuck in your body? So in some ways it's made it worse, and people don't see that. They think, oh, it's great progress. Instead of dying at home, you can die in a hospital. Wonderful. This is progress, and of course you have to pay for it. All the then that we are eternal living beings, that we may have more affluence in terms of material products like iPhones and iPads and smartphones and computers and automobiles, and now we have hybrid automobiles which are not so polluting. At least we don't see the pollution and breathe it, because we just plug in to get our electric cars juiced up, and the electricity is being produced somewhere else, and it's all wonderful, but we're not happy because we are eternal spiritual beings, and titillation of the senses of the body doesn't satisfy our real self or our inner self. But of course, the scientific, materialistic, and ultimately atheistic worldview doesn't accept that there is any eternal self, because we can't see it, we can't touch it, we can't taste it, we can't smell it, we can't feel it. We don't need it for our scientific observations, although actually in quantum science you do. How about that? The observer is required. Then it becomes into philosophy and metaphysics and this and that. But anyway, still, despite the introduction, the necessary introduction of consciousness into scientific understanding, still the general trend is to, within scientific circles, and I'm speaking in a very broad way, is to think that consciousness must be a product of matter. We can't understand it now, but hey, you know what? We didn't understand that germs were the cause of disease previously. We didn't understand that light and magnetism and sound, they're all different aspects of energy. And in fact, there's so many things we didn't understand. So if we don't understand consciousness, don't worry, we'll make some more experiments and we will understand. Science and technology are the key to advancement, progress. And the proof of that, I'm not promoting this, by the way. I might sound enthusiastic about it, but I'm on Prabhupada's side. But I'm just saying what they say, or the underlying idea. Even if you go to just like I went to a Roman Catholic school, but the education was on the basis of this science, technology, progress, all this kind of thing. The underlying worldview wasn't that Jesus died on the cross and Hail Mary and all that kind of stuff. So the idea is that science means progress, and the proof is the Western world, which is the home of science and technology. Let's face it, folks, India and other countries are just backward because they're way behind in all this. It's all coming from the West, and even if someone's going to be a very successful scientist in India or other countries, mostly they go to America or other Western countries, although there are still some good scientists or productive scientists who stayed in India, but mostly they all go to the Western world. Other countries like China and India have developed later, and they've also come up, and they're also becoming or are world powers. But countries are powerful and prominent and affluent to the degree that they develop science and technology, which is culturally a Western enterprise. And we can see that the dominance of Western culture, even in countries, even in China, which is proud of its ancient culture, but it's so much influenced by the Western cultural outlook that, as we used to see on the advertisements in the airports in the days when we were traveling around the world, that there are more people in China learning English than there are people in England. In so many ways, you see the head of the Emperor of China, the head of China, the lifelong president. He wears absolutely Western dress, and Western dress is pretty much the standard largely all over the world. And even if you go to remote places anywhere in seemingly, or what nowadays they don't call them backward countries, they call them developing countries, although they don't seem to be developing at a rate that when I was a kid they're developing, and they're still developing, and they don't seem to be catching up. But anyway, say you go to some remote village in Africa and you'll find people wearing Western styles, men wearing Western style shirts and pants, even if it's just like here in India, this kind of, especially wearing these pants made from polyester materials is absolutely not right for this climate. You need cool cotton, the traditional dress, like such as the dhoti or the lungi or the sarong made from cotton are very suitable for these warm climates, but people prefer to use pants. And in most of the world, women also wear Western style dress, and that's true in China and everywhere. These are just examples of how Western culture has been accepted as dominant all over the world. And there are innumerable and very deep and serious problems associated with the materialistic outlook, which is associated with the Western culture and ideological dominance. But then who's philosophical? Materialism seems to obviate the need for philosophy. Philosophy, what do you need philosophy for? You've got motor cars and superhighways, and we're going to the moon, we're going to Mars. What do you need to get all idealistic and thinking? What's the point? That seems to be the general way of thinking. And here in India also, development, what we really need is more development. The fact that development is causing so many problems all over the world, and what they call development, urbanization, industrialization, and it's causing so many problems in India, but no one seems to care about that because it's just presumed that this is what we got to do. We've got to go the way the West has gone and develop. Show ourselves to be big. Show ourselves to be advanced. So, we as members of the Krishna Consciousness movement, serving the mission of Srila Prabhupada, which is the mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which is ultimately Prema Pumarato Mahan, the highest need, or the real need of everyone is to develop pure love of Krishna, but to introduce that wide scale, it's not just a few people here and there, which was Srila Prabhupada's mission. We have to penetrate their ideological fortress and implant deeply and widely the understanding that human life is not, or any life or anything, is not simply the interaction of impersonal forces, that we are eternal, living, spiritual beings. We cannot be satisfied by any amount of material so-called progress and advancement. We don't die when the body dies. Our real need is spiritual, not material, because we are not material beings. We are not the bodies. And we need a whole way of life based on this understanding. The misunderstanding that material so-called progress is what humans really need, this is to be replaced. It's a massive job to do that. In the Western liberal society, agnostic society means the idea that, yeah, it might be this, it might be that. You can believe what you like, as long as it doesn't do harm to others. As long as it doesn't impinge on their sense gratification, you can do what you like, you can believe what you like. So if people want to chant Hare Krishna or be Christians or Muslims or atheists or gays or bisexuals or whatever, you want to divorce and remarry, or you don't want to marry at all, and more or less whatever you want to do, it's okay, folks. What does it matter? As long as we're all happy and we're all living and you can believe what you like, and Krishna consciousness is like that also, because there's no ultimate truth. And if people want to believe all these different things, like there's God is blue and all this kind of thing, well, okay, if it makes them happy, the aim of life is to be happy. Anyway, you die, so if you want to believe that and you want to sing in the streets and chant Hare Krishna, okay, let them believe it, but we can't take it seriously. It's a belief, and maybe it's quite an interesting belief, and it can be a subject of academic study, just like in the universities they study Buddhism and Shintoism and Christianity, and yeah, we can also have a department which studies this Vaishnavism or Indian culture. We can study it as a belief, but and it can be taken. That means they're taking it somewhat seriously if they study it in the universities, but not as a serious ideological alternative. It's studied in such a way that, yeah, it's there. It's part of human culture. It's one of the myriad contributions to the human ethos. So yeah, we can have a few scholars studying that. And the really serious scholars, they study science and how to make vaccines against coronavirus and how to make bigger, better, more efficient military systems to outdo the scientists in Russia and China and other places who are also researching, trying to outdo us. And some scholars, they can also study those other things, make them happy, give them a grant, and so on. His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada established the Bhaktivedanta Institute to address at the very roots the Western materialistic civilization, its whole basis in science, by showing that some of the major defects of science and to demonstrate by science that there is God, which is it's a big challenge. To use the basically flawed methodology of science to prove that there is God, it's a very big challenge, especially whereas in science there is the presumption that we don't need any God, and that even to introduce God is unscientific. The whole outlook is Brahm Pramad Vipralipsa Karana Patav, mistakes, illusion, cheating, imperfect senses. This is at the basis of the materialistic worldview, but it's on the basis of this materialistic worldview that science has developed. So again, it's using the wooden handle to cut the tree. We're using their methodology to show the flaws in their own methodology. And Bhaktivedanta Institute was also formed to address philosophy. Srila Prabhupada, philosophy in a broader sense. Srila Prabhupada himself was highly philosophical, in the sense that he was always talking in terms of understanding reality as it is, although his approach to philosophy was absolutely different to what goes on in the world in the name of philosophy nowadays, mostly. Srila Prabhupada was very concerned to address the Western philosophical outlook. Of course, what you can call the Indian philosophical outlook. He addressed impersonalism and voidism from the for want of a better term, Indian perspective, but he also he had a series of discussions on the ideas of Western philosophers. The book that came out of that, Dialectic Spiritualism. But he repeatedly pointed out the basic epistemic flaw of the whole Western outlook, or the materialistic outlook. I'm saying Western, not that we have anything against the West in particular, but it is a fact that society at the present time is very much dominated by materialistic science, or scientific materialism, which has very strongly got its roots and up to the present day its base in the Western world, and is very strongly identified with Western civilization and culture. So Srila Prabhupada wanted to point out that the basic epistemic differences, that by making man the measure of all things, we can manipulate nature, which is the endeavor of modern science, to manipulate nature for man's benefit. So you can do that, and that may seem to be very advanced, but you cannot understand ultimate reality, which is beyond the ability of our mind and senses to ascertain. Avang manasa gochara. In other words, if we are to understand ultimate reality, it has to be through the mind and the intelligence, but we're going to require a higher order intelligence to minister down to us. So in other words, instead of, here we are folks, here I am, cogito ergo sum, here I am, and what's going on in the world, let's check it out and try and understand and organize it using our intelligence, rather than this bottom-up approach, top-down. There is knowledge beyond what we can understand. With our limited mind, senses, and intelligence, we have to take knowledge from God. Now, of course, it's true that not everyone in the world, even in the Western world, accepts science, and there are many signs that people don't do so. Many people are distrustful of the whole civilization, the way it's set up in the Western world. Many people are distrustful of science and modern medicine, and they're trying to revert to natural healing and traditional medicines. But still, even people who don't subscribe to the Western way of life, we're still very much influenced by that whole way of thinking, including ourselves as devotees or aspiring devotees of Krishna. We subscribe to, for instance, in medicine, if something is wrong with the body, we tend to think, well, maybe there's some chemical imbalance. We don't look to the Ayurvedic approach. That it's not exactly a chemical imbalance, but there's an imbalance in the whole working of the system. So that's just one example of how and again, the example of weather. When it rains, we think, yeah, it's because there's clouds are being carried in the sky by the wind and this, but we don't think of Indra. So we tend to accept this, and but there are many who are in the Western world also who don't subscribe to this, and who are looking for or involved in different kinds of alternative views of reality. And so we have the whole New Age phenomenon, quasi or pseudo-spiritualism, with Buddhism, and Buddhism, the most prominent proponent of Buddhism in the present world today, Dalai Lama. There's only one type of Buddhism. There are so many types of Buddhism. But he's very comfortable, as it seems many or most Buddhists are, with the whole scientific endeavor. You say, yeah, we don't have any problem with that. Yeah. But be a Buddhist also. Yoga, it's not exactly spiritual, especially the way it's taught in the world today. It's for bodily health. But it's definitely influenced and become part of the culture of much of the Western world. And so these are also, I mean, apart from the scientific, materialistic way of looking, outlook, the Krishna consciousness movement also has to address these apparently spiritual or semi-spiritual ways of thinking if we're going to spread Krishna consciousness very widely, as Srila Prabhupada wanted. Then, of course, here in India, there's orthodox Mayavad, which is very difficult to deal with, very, very tough. It's the whole philosophical sophistication that they have. And generally, Nirvishesha, Shunyavadi, all over the world, if anyone gets spiritual, they mostly tend toward this New Ageism and Buddhism. It's what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, that all over the world, people who become spiritual, they all have very similar realizations, and it all tends towards impersonalism, and this experience of being one with everything, which incidentally many quantum physicists, they say, yeah, well, that's true, we are one with everything, but in a totally materialistic way. Yeah, this impersonalism, that's what we're up against. And it may be Christians and Muslims, when they have their spiritual experience, it all seems to point to impersonalism. So on the one hand, we have to deal with the gross materialism, the scientific outlook, which underpins that, and then the spiritualism, which isn't really or fully spiritual. So there is a huge amount of intellectual work to do. This is what I'm getting at. After all that, speaking for 1 hour or something, there is a lot of intellectual work to do by the members of the Krishna consciousness movement to present Krishna consciousness as, yes, it's nice, singing and dancing, nice food and all these things, but real knowledge means the knowledge given in the Vedas, in the Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam. This we have to establish in human society. Where do you begin? Srila Prabhupada established the Bhaktivedanta Institute to attempt to not just chip away at the scientific edifice, but to actually change it. It's a huge job. And culturally, the religion, what do we do? Have interfaith meetings. It's very tough because at interfaith meetings they want to discuss in a very general way. When you come to specifics, then they say, well, that's your belief. Again, it comes to belief. Then there's the whole world of Indology, which in the universities, which in the past, the Western scholars, they used to be very demeaning of Indian culture or any culture apart from their own, but nowadays they're more polite, as Sadar Puttaprabhu pointed out. Nowadays they won't say, well, it's just all primitive nonsense, but they still treat it in a generally agnostic way. It's just another kind of belief. And why shouldn't you think like that? Because there are so many beliefs all over the world. So many people believe so many things. And so if we study Vaishnavism, well, it's just another belief. Now, of course, traditionally Vaishnavas, they never accepted such thing, that it's one way among many, but it is the one way. And that was the ethos in Indian culture, that there were different philosophers who tried to establish their theories as being superior. And we find Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when he traveled in South India, he met Sri Vaishnavas, Tattvavadis, Jains, Buddhists, followers of the Sankhya philosophy, and he met with them and established his philosophy as superior. He met with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, he met with Prakashananda Saraswati. It wasn't a question of, well, what do you believe? I believe this, I believe that. No, he wanted to establish it as being superior. So again, the whole idea that, well, there are so many different ideas, there's no absolute truth, very, very difficult to cut through. In the Indology field, in a very broad terms, we can say that there are Indians who are addressing the problem of Indian culture and philosophy being considered second class and backward. There are those who are doing that. Rajiv Malhotra is a prominent figure in this field. But his and the approach of others, it's somewhat hybrid, because they accept that the scientific outlook is very good on one hand, but on the other hand they want to promote that, yeah, India can stand, and we can say something too. Don't treat us as second class. It's not one to establish that you need to hear what we have to say, but rather that, yeah, we also have something to say. Srila Prabhupada came with this Krishna consciousness is the absolute truth. You should understand it. This is reality. This is the fact. It's a different approach. Scholars who present in that manner, they are understood in their own niche, but they're not accepted like that. By the Western agnostic scholars. A great example of this is the recently not so recently, B.N.K. Sharma wrote so many books in English on Madhva philosophy, English of course mixed up with a lot of Sanskrit necessarily, showing the superiority of Madhva philosophy, or explaining how Madhva, his philosophical system, is superior. And no Madhva will accept anything else. They won't say, well, it's just one opinion and there are so many different opinions. Madhva, maybe more than any Vaishnava, was very, very strong. This is the way it is. You have to accept it like this. But that approach is rejected at the outset by the agnostic academia, which makes it very, very difficult for the approach that Srila Prabhupada had, which is to say, this is correct, this is the way it is, you should accept it. You can't even get your foot in the door. Some of our devotees in ISKCON have entered the academia in the Indology field, but to be allowed to enter, you have to present your ideas in such a way that it's not that, yes, this is correct, but it has to be presented just like, for instance, I'll give an example, I've given it many times. You can't write in what would an acceptable scholarly manner, acceptable in the modern academia. Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is a fact. You can write, Gauriya Vaishnavas accept as a fact that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That you can do. It's also true. But it is a relative statement of truth. It is not an absolute statement of truth. So to have your foot in the door, to be able to make any influence, to bring respectability to Gauriya Vaishnavism, to try to bring it amongst that very small number of scholars in the world who study Vaishnavism and Vedic culture anyway, the endeavor to bring Gauriya Vaishnavism to the level of acceptance of that, or to be taken as serious objects of study, just as the teachings and philosophy of Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, and for that matter, Ramakrishna and Vivekananda our devotees have entered the academia, but it's at a cost of having to state ideas in a roundabout way, or maybe even state things which, strictly speaking, Gauriya Vaishnavas shouldn't do. So they've been able to enter that world, and they've made progress in the sense that in the academic world, some of our devotees are accepted, they're authorities, but it's at a cost. That we have to pose ourselves as one of them. And if you cease to do that, if you say that, okay, now you accept me as an authority, well, I want to tell you this. Sakala eva vihaya durach chaitanya chandra charane kuruta anuragaha. Just forget all that hogwash, bogus ideas that you had, and surrender at the lotus feet of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You'll be out immediately. An example of this, Fred Hoyle, Sir Fred Hoyle. He got as far as being knighted by the Queen of England for his tremendous contributions to astronomy. But then, when he went against the Big Bang Theory and he became a promoter of the solid state theory, then he was out. He was one of the very few scientists who got as far as being recognized to the level that he was knighted by the Queen. He was highly respected, but then when he presented a theory as being factual, which was against the predominant theory in the scientific world at the time, he was just, people said, well, he lost it. He's out, and he's no longer accepted seriously by mainstream science. So it's the same thing. We can enter Indology, and we can make progress, we can become accepted, but the moment we try to present Krishna consciousness as the absolute truth, we're in trouble. Now, of course, Krishna consciousness does accept that there are other religious processes also. It's not some kind of fanaticism, fundamentalism, dogmatism, but at the same time it has a very definite worldview, and which is in opposition to the basically agnostic worldview which is prominent in the world today, and Srila Prabhupada recognized that and he wanted to address it. So it's a very dangerous path to enter that world, where we have to present ourselves as being part of the agnostic academia, and it can create confusion if on one hand we're teaching in a manner that is acceptable by the agnostic academia. On the other hand, we don't really believe it. It can create confusion in our own minds and in the minds of others, and it can confuse our whole tradition also when respected devotees have to write things and say things that traditionally acharyas would be opposed to. Anyway, we do have a huge amount of intellectual work to do. Now the Vedic Planetarium is coming up in Mayapur to establish the veracity of Vedic cosmology. It's a astronomical challenge. The Vedic worldview, for instance, that Srimad Bhagavatam predates Buddha. Well, Bhagavad Gita predates Buddha. Well, it doesn't seem like that, because this, and that. There are certain things in these texts which seem to be responses to Buddha. But then if we don't accept that it predates Buddha, then Kikateshu Bhavishyati, that Buddha will appear later in the future, the very text of Bhagavatam becomes suspect. If we can't present Bhagavatam as it is, then we can't establish Krishna consciousness in the world as it is. But to do so means to go against the whole academic view of it. Without that, without establishing the reality, the fact of Srimad Bhagavatam being the ultimate knowledge, then we're stuck in the little niche that nice people want to put us into, being a religious belief. So we can try with bridge preaching and Krishna West and progressive Vaishnavism, and now we have prosperity Vaishnavism, life coaching, but these are all adaptations to the Western way or the materialistic society. It's presenting Krishna consciousness as part of that instead of as an alternative to it. Our whole approach in Krishna consciousness aims at purification of the consciousness. When Srila Prabhupada arrived in America, he saw immediately, Rajas Tamaguna era Shabaya Channa. Everyone here is covered by the lower modes of nature. Srila Prabhupada's approach to change that was to purify the people by massive Harinam, distribution of his books, prasad distribution, festivals. If people are going to accept this Krishna conscious way of life, there's going to have to be an intellectual approach, but also purification of conscious, cultural approach. Srila Prabhupada had great faith in the power of pure devotion, giving repeatedly association to people. By associating with him, by associating with Srila Prabhupada, people became convinced of his genuine saintliness. But it wasn't just that he was walking around being saintly, but he gave the knowledge of Srimad Bhagavatam, and he had the faith that Bhagavate Kata She Bhagavate Kata She Tava Abata Dhira hoye jadi shune kane barba. Srila Prabhupada had the faith that if people could become a little cool-headed and hear the message of Bhagavatam again and again, that would purify them. So, this is the challenge, to get the message of Bhagavatam out by distributing the books and speaking that message. It is very difficult to get a chink in the materialistic worldview, but if we speak the message of Bhagavatam, that will appeal to people's soul. It has to be repeated again and again and again. And there is also the Bhaktivedanta Institute approach for hardened intellectuals, hardcore, materialistic, agnostic, and so on. But Srila Prabhupada's main approach, lot of Harinam, public lot of book distribution, and speaking the message of Krishna consciousness as it is. So we're up. What are we up against? What are we up against? It's a great challenge to change the whole way of thinking of the whole world. That is the challenge that Srila Prabhupada gave to us. In this talk, I've given a very broad overview of what we're up against. Simplistic, if you like, because there are so many nuances in understanding this. But we should understand, it's a great challenge. We have to pray to Srila Prabhupada, follow what he's doing, speak the message of Bhagavatam, distribute these books, be devotees, as Srila Prabhupada wanted us to be. Pray to Krishna for his mercy, and the world can change, the world will change. This whole completely bewildered materialistic civilization can become a completely blissful spiritual civilization, chanting Hare Krishna. As you can hear in the background, it is possible. Hare Krishna. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah.